The National Portrait Gallery has many, many portraits of people who have contributed to the British way of life. And amongst their collections of kings and queens and engineers and politicians and prime ministers, there's a beautiful selection of comedians, British comedians who have influenced the British way of life, perhaps in their own way as much as George III did. The first of the really big post-war comedians was a guy from Birmingham called Sid Field, who people wouldn't remember these days, but he was an enormously popular comedian and very influential as well. He first appeared in the West End in a show in 1943 at the Prince of Wales Theatre called Strike a New Note. And two 17-year-old comics who were forming a double act used to watch him in the wings every night, and that was Eric Morecambe and Ernie Wise. Radio became a very important medium for the working comedian. Before that, most of them had been playing at sort of variety halls and the music halls, 30s and 40s. You'd be travelling around the circuit. You might be playing Glasgow or Shepherd's Bush Empire or somewhere in Birmingham. And in those days, particularly the sort of before radio really took hold, there was a north-south divide. There was such a thing as northern comics and southern comics. A southern comic like Max Miller, who's based in Brighton, he wouldn't go beyond Birmingham. He was once asked why he didn't go to Glasgow, and he said, "I'm not a missionary." And equally, Scottish comedians would find it very difficult to come down to London, so they generally didn't. Tony Hancock in the 1950s, I suppose, was one of the comedians of the decade. His radio show, written by Ray Gorton and Alan Simpson, was an incredibly beautifully written, constructed piece of work. Anthony Aloysius St. John Hancock, as his fictional name gave him, was a sort of a man of the 50s. He had hope, he had desires, he had to deal with petrol rationing, he was sometimes very disappointed by the circumstances he found himself in. And the other sort of show of the 50s that was really incredibly influential was The Goon Show, written primarily by Spike Milligan, starring himself, Harry Seacombe and Peter Sellers. And we see, if you look at The Goon Show, it's really sort of every episode is really about surviving the Second World War. People get blown up the whole time. There's terrible sort of explosions happening, and it's about comedy in a battlefield, and the noises, the strange sound effects you could suddenly have of a grand piano crossing the Atlantic at speed, and you just hear the sound of a piano being played very quickly. There's one joke I remember, one character's hiding inside a piano. He said, "What are you doing in that piano?" He said, "I'm hiding." He said, "Don't be ridiculous, hiding's been dead for years." A show called Beyond the Fringe, which opened in the early 1960s, was an extremely influential show. It starred Alan Bennett, Jonathan Miller, Dudley Moore and Peter Cook. And those four people, first of all, the show was a massive hit in Edinburgh, and then it became a big hit on the West End stage. And then they went to America with it. But what also happened in the 1960s was television. The growth of television meant that these people who had appeared on stage in a popular show could then build a television career. Peter Cook and Dudley Moore came out of Beyond the Fringe. They started appearing in their own television shows, not only but also from that they started appearing in feature films as a double act, and they were the first real sort of double act that wrote their own material. Like a lot of these people that came out of Oxbridge, they wrote their own material. Particularly Peter Cook, he was an extremely able and brilliant writer, and so they were able to have a bigger sort of control over their career than these other comics in the past, who were reliant on scripts, reliant on old routines. By the end of the decade, 1969, the various people that had come through Oxford, people like Michael Palin and Terry Jones, Graham Chapman, John Cleese, Eric Idle, they were all sort of founder members of Monty Python, along with Terry Gilliam, the American director, and they were able to sort of take the whole concept of the sketch show, which had been sort of like, 2-minute sketches and another 2-minute sketch, and just tear the whole thing to bits. So suddenly you might have the Spanish Inquisition running through a door into a country house. One character from one sketch invading another sketch, and it's sort of like a television version of the Goons. One of the acts that came through the whole variety experience in the 1950s and then started moving into TV in the 60s was Morecambe and Wise, Eric Morecambe and Ernie Wise. And their TV career really took off in the early 60s with ATV television, and then they moved to the BBC later on, and those are the shows that we remember so fondly, the ones that were made in colour. And their technique was honed in front of a live audience. Unlike Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, they had a big sort of theatrical background to draw on. And I think that's why their stuff survives as well as it does, because the amount of work they put into the performance of the material, the timing, the looks, the rapport between the two of them is something that isn't, you can't fake that. You have to sort of earn that through live performance. Perhaps the biggest thing to happen in comedy in this country since the Second World War, really, was the opening of the Comedy Store in London in 1979. Now, what that meant was it was suddenly a democracy. You didn't have to have been to Oxford to be a comedian. You didn't have to be a working class northern comic or a Butlins redcoat or something like that. If you fancy getting up on stage, you could. You could just get up on stage. If the audience liked you, they'd have you back. If they didn't like you, then you walked home alone. What also sort of really changed the face of comedy then was also the opening up of Channel 4, because Channel 4 were looking for lots of, lots of hours to broadcast, a lot of material to find, and they were coming to comedians on the sort of beginning of the comedy circuit in London around about the early 80s, and they were coming to people like me, and I was doing a show called Whose Line Is It Anyway, along with Josie Lawrence and Tony Slattery and lots of other people. And Jack D was coming along, he was doing stuff for television, Channel 4, and Vic Reeves and Bob Mortimer, again, they came through from Channel 4. And I think Channel 4 at that time was a home for sort of new experimental comedy in a way that the BBC would not have touched at that point. It always feels to me that a comedy club is a particularly sort of male environment. It can be, lots of drinking and around, and if you're an attractive woman, you get heckled for that. If you're not an attractive woman, you get heckled for that. So you have to be sort of, Joan Brand would come out with these sort of self-deprecatory remarks, really to beat the hecklers at their own game. So if she said I'm fat before they did, then she clearly, was winning. But when you look at sort of women in comedy, it's impossible to avoid the magnificent Victoria Wood, who just in the sort of 70s and 80s and beyond wrote the most extraordinarily beautiful sketches and films and plays and comedy songs and just had the whole package of being, she was the originator of everything that she did. The Carry On team, we think of all those Carry On films from the late 50s onwards, they were immensely popular here, quite cheap to make, but nowhere else were they particularly popular. They didn't mean anything in the States, Carry On Constable, Kenneth Williams or Charles Hawtrey, these characters didn't translate into America. Today the tradition still carries on. Simon Pegg is currently doing very well in the world of cinema. He's made a couple of films that I think are very good, Hot Fuzz and the other one Shaun of the Dead. Were very well done, brilliantly written and directed, I thought, and also comedy sometimes can aim a bit low, and Simon Pegg doesn't. He aims high. He aims to make good films. It's not just sort of somebody standing there swearing or shouting or whatever. There's a real thought that goes into what he does, and he can offer me a part any time. My favourite comedian, perhaps of all the ones that I've mentioned, is a guy called Max Miller, who came to prominence in the 1930s. And what I like about him is that his style is still very fresh, feels very modern. You can see acts before him, and you can see that they're part of the Victorian, Edwardian type of musical. And it feels very old-fashioned and dated, but his stuff still works very well. As one of his jokes, a big favourite of mine, I always like this joke, he said, he used to come on, he'd have a very sort of floral sort of suit and a bit of a sort of wide boy and a hat and a sort of, hit with the ladies, a ladies man, that was the kind of image he put across. And he said, I went home the other night, I said to the wife here, I says, I hear the milkman has made love to every woman in this street bar one. And she said, I bet that stuck-up cow at number 54.